Hello. Today I'd like to show you how to make a block. It's a quilt as you go block, and it's a reversible block. So we've got, in this case, because I've done similar colorings, I've got the same thing both sides, but I've got a different color in my color there. So this is not a particularly speedy block. On the other hand, if you think that you've managed to piece it and quilt it and back it all in one go, it's really not so bad. But you do need to take a little bit of care while you're doing it. But I just thought it might be a fun alternative to some of the other quilt as you go blocks that I've seen around. So what we're going to start with is some 2.5-inch strips. We're using 2.5-inch strips for this block. You could of course use different sizes, but that's the size we're using. And so I've got some strips and things here which I'm using. I've got a light colour for my main colour, and then I've got various other colours of strips that I'm using here. And so I would lay those on my board and cut them, but in fact I've actually already cut my strips to size. So we're just going to start off. We need a square in the middle, and that's going to be a 2.5-inch square, and then these strips, so then a square either side in the colour that's also 2.5-inch, so two of those. And these strips here, because it's 2, 4, 6 inches by then, will be 6.5 inches long. So everything's 2.5 inches wide. Just to give you a bit of an idea, but we'll go through that as we go along. So I'm going to work on a piece of batting. Now I've just got a lightweight synthetic batting here. Something not too heavy is probably quite good, and if it does have a little bit of see-throughness, that's possibly a little bit helpful, but not essential. So I've actually cut that. The block we're making is going to finish at 10 inches square. So I've cut my batting to 11 inches square. Now you could make it a bit bigger because sometimes things move a little bit and we're going to trim it down. But I've cut mine to 11 inches square, and it's quite helpful to know what size it is because we've got to find the centre. So because mine is 11 inches, I know that if I come along 5.5 inches using the markings on my board, that's actually going to be halfway across my batting, because I'm trying to find the centre here, and I can turn the batting around, and the same thing, if I come across 5.5 inches, I get my centre. So I can pop a couple of pins in there so that where they cross over is my actual centre. So then I'm going to take one of the centre squares, because I've got my squares and bits. I'll just move these out the way here, bring these down. I've got my bits all ready to sew together because we're sewing both sides at the same time. Okay, so my central square that's going in there, I just want to finger press a halfway that way, and I also want to fold it the other way and finger press it, just so I can find the centre of that square, because I need to lay that on top of where I've marked with my pins there. And then I've got to pull those pins out, and I'm going to pin that square in place. Now if you're not quite sure if it's in the right place, again you can come back with your ruler and have a little look, and that's looking pretty central that way to the 5.5 inches, and that's my line. That also is looking pretty good that way, so it's pretty much in the middle. So that's what we're wanting. So I'm going to turn that over now with that piece pinned on, and pin my centre piece onto the other side. Now this is where, if you can see through, it kind of helps you position it, but the same thing, you could go through that same process to get that into the middle. And I'm going to pop a pin in there, and this time all the way through the square on the back as well. And now I'm going to pin my first piece that I'm going to sew. It's going to be this bright green, and just make sure you're not crinkling up your fabrics when you're pinning them. I'm going to be sewing down one side, so I'm actually going to pull that pin back out again now, pop it back in again, including the next bit of coloured square. And I'm going to flip that over, and my other colour that I'm using is already here to go, and I'm going to lay that on top of that square also, but this time I'm going to pin it just about where my seam allowance would go. So we're using a regular 1/4-inch seam allowance, and we're going to go through, pin it pretty much in the same place as we'll be sewing it, give or take, and that allows us to then look on the other side to see where that's pinned. Now that's come in just a little bit, but I've actually pinned it in just a little bit. I probably shouldn't have pulled that pin out. So I'm now going to sew that 1/4-inch seam allowance down there, because I can see that it's pretty much sitting over the top of the other one. And so I've got a 1/4-inch seam on my machine, and I can start just a little bit beyond the square. You're not going to see any of the stitching, so it's not a problem. and just do my regular 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now because we're working on this batting, it may just want to move around a little bit, and that's why we've cut it slightly larger than our block's going to be, because it may end up being just a little bit wonky. So now I'm going to bring those out, and I'm not ironing as I go because I don't want to keep ironing the batting, but I'm just, I guess, hand pressing, finger pressing, whatever you want to call it. And now the same thing, I've got to pop the other square on top of there. So right sides together, I'm going to position that one over there. Doesn't really matter which side you're working from. I'm just going to pin it in place so it sits there. Bring back to this side, and I'm going to place my other colour, again right sides together, on top there. And this time again I'm going to pin pretty much where the seam allowance goes, just so that I can double check that everything's sitting pretty much in the right place, which it seems to be. Back to the machine to sew that little seam. So you can see it's not a speedy, but it's not too bad. You've just got to take a little bit of care that everything is sitting straight. And it's quite exciting to think that your quilt can be reversible. So I'm going to pull that out and pull that out. So that's sitting quite nicely now. And now I'm ready for my next strip. Now this one, they were all 2.5 inch squares. This one here is 2.5 inches wide, but it's 6.5 inches long. So I'm going to just position that on there. And this time I'm just going to pop 2 pins in just to hold it in place, somewhere down here, not where you're going to be sewing. We're going to be sewing that top edge there. Flip that over. You see now that's moved a little bit, so we have to watch things like that. Keep these as straight as you can. And now I'm going to position this piece, again, right sides together, right across there. And this time I'm going to pop 2 pins in, pretty much where I think my seam allowance, the seam is going to go. One at pretty much each end of that. And I'm going to just double check that that's looking pretty good for 1/4 inch. It kind of wants to bubble a little bit because of the batting, and these flat pins are really good because they don't make too much of a bump. So now we'll go back and sew this seam. So I thought it would be quite a good idea to take you through the whole block so that you can just see how things go all the way. We're looking pretty good today. So I'm just going to flip that out. And flip that one out. Now I'm going to lay my next piece over the top here, right sides together, same thing, pop a couple of holding pins in lower down, away we're going to be sewing that seam next. Flip that over, and right sides together, pop that one in place, and again pop the pins in pretty much where your seam is going to go. And you can just continue building out like this. That's looking pretty good. So again, back to the machine. So if you can keep things as straight as you can, they do want to move a little bit. But you can keep them fairly straight if you're able to by using some pins and things. That is very helpful with this method. And I have done my block so that it's the same both sides, in the sense of where I've put my light main colour. You could reverse that, you could do a different colour there, you could do all sorts of things really. I just thought it would be quite a good way to do it so that it is pretty much the same, just a different colour in here each side. So now that's up to that point. We've just got one more round to go. So now we want to turn that around because we're going to sew across a seam end here. That's sitting out nice and flat. And I've got my piece here. Now these are also 6.5 inches long because it's still only that size. So these are the same length as those ones that we've just put on. So you want to put that down right sides together. Again, just your holding pins to hold it in place. Flip it over and grab the next piece and pop our pins in. So you can see it's moved just a little bit here, but I'm not going to worry too much about that. I'm just going to go for a straight line across there. Check my seam allowance is looking pretty good. Just needs to come down a touch here. That's better. And now sew that seam. Because I'm working with something that's actually not quite white, but it looks a lot like a white, it's a very pale blue, and I might see that little bit showing through. I could at this stage just trim that off a little bit so that that doesn't show through, because I don't really want to see it. Normally you would hope not to have these little bits sticking up, but it does happen, so we just work with what we've got. Because we've under other circumstances, our block would actually measure 10.5 inches, so we've got a little bit of room to play with little bits and pieces that do that to us. So that's that side. Now turn it round and we're going to pop the other end on just the same. Again, I've got a little bit of that green sticking up there. I'm not going to worry about it. I'm going to flip that over and put this piece on here, put my 2 pins in, check where my seams are going to go. This one could come up a touch. It's looking pretty good. So again, back to the sewing machine. This is quite exciting really, because I've pieced front, back and quilted it as well. And same thing, I'm just going to trim off that little bit of green that's sticking up there because I don't want to see that. Just make sure you're not cutting into your batting or anything when you do this. Pull my pins out. That's ready to go up there and there. Oh, 2 more sides to go. Okay, so I'm going to go to this side. I'm going to grab my piece. Now this piece is now cut at 10.5 inches long. So still with our 2.5 inch wide strip, but we're 10.5 inches long now. Just a couple of holding pins. And I do find it easier to work just with one piece at a time rather than doing the sort of top and bottom of the block, because just because it's a little bit awkward, a little bit spongy, and because things have a little mind of their own and want to move occasionally. So I find that by just doing it a bit at a time, I have better control. Okay, just check my seam allowance. Down a little bit there. It's a good idea just to make sure that you're covering your ends well, your seams. It's better. And that one's looking pretty good. Back to the sewing machine. Good. And that's looking good. Okay, one lucky last to go. So right sides together, lay my piece over there, put my pins in, flip it over, next piece right sides together, pin that in place. Yep, seams are looking pretty good. And back to the sewing machine. This is our last seam, so we're doing pretty well here. I've got a little bit of that background showing there, so I'm just going to trim that off. And now we're ready to trim the block. I'll show you how I do that. Again, I use the markings on my board quite a lot, but we have got a very respectable looking quilted pieced block there. So I'm just going to bring the iron over. I'm not going to iron it hard because of the batting, but I am just going to give it a light press so that everything's sitting relatively flat for me to be able to trim it down now. So I don't want to iron it down really hard, but this just helps everything sit nicely. If you iron it hard, you might iron all that fluffiness and air out of it, which probably wouldn't be very helpful for a quilt. Okay, so I'm going to trim that down now to measure 10 inches. So I'm just going to use the markings on my board to help me with this. And I'm going to have a look here for this. This should measure 2 inches across in my square here, and it's pretty close with my ruler, and I can see where those lines are. So I can line up the center of my square, top and bottom, by using that 1 inch marking on my ruler. And I just need to bring this over a touch so it's not exactly 2 inches, so that that's looking pretty square. Now I just want to keep an eye on where things are, because I'm going to be trimming on this line down here and this line down here, and we might just need to go back just a touch, because I'm going to now measure out 5 inches from that center line. So that's out, that was my center line, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and I'm going to trim on that, and I'm keeping an eye that everything's sitting fairly straight this way as well. So I'm going to trim that little bit off there, won't be very much. Now I can turn that around, and I'm going to come across 10 inches from this line here, which will be onto this line here, and that's looking pretty good. And just trim that off, so that's now 10 inches across. Now I want to do the same thing in the other direction. I use the markings on my board quite a lot because it just helps you line everything up nicely. And I can see that I'm doing pretty well. Again, I can just double check that center line of my block is sitting pretty well central to that. And because you've trimmed these two edges now, you can actually line those up with your board as well, which will help you keep everything nice and straight. And so now I want to trim, again, 5 inches away from that central line. So I come out to here, just a little whisker off there, turn it around and do the same thing here. So that should all now be sitting at 10 inches square. So even with those little anomalies that we had, we've still worked that into a very acceptable double-sided quilt as you go block, which I'm very pleased with. And I've made a couple of others here so that I can just show you how that will work. I'm not going to show you today how to put them together because I've covered that in a previous video of how to join up quilt as you go blocks and borders and things, and that was in Quilting Tips and Techniques video number 074, in case you're wanting to have a look at that. So I've done 4 blocks all together, and one of them I did do it so that I reversed the colour system, so that would be an option for you, but there's kind of all these different colours you can play with that just make it kind of fun. So if I was going to join that up, because I've used fairly bold colours, I probably would use the same colours in here, but on each seam I might use a different colour. So I might use something like, these are my strips ready for when I do it, and they'll end up, of course, only 1/2 inch on that method that I use, but I might use that colour for that seam. I might go all the way through with that colour, so that you get that whole sort of colour thing continuing on through. But I hope that was helpful. It was just to show you a reversible quilt as you go block that could be quite a lot of fun to use. You could use all sorts of different colours, different fabrics, of course. But I thought that was quite exciting. I quite like the idea that I can have my quilt all done, and it's quite a little bit interesting too. Thank you.